Last time, we looked at the empty tomb and found that none of the standard alternative explanations, wrong tomb, swoon, theft, cover-up, really hold up under scrutiny. But an empty tomb only proves absence. It doesn't prove resurrection. For that, the New Testament points to something else entirely: appearances. Not one report from one overly emotional follower, but a pattern: multiple people in multiple locations on multiple occasions, claiming to have seen, touched, and spoken with Jesus after his death. Today, we are looking at who saw him, what alternative explanation had been offered, and, maybe most compelling of all, what happened to the people who claimed to see him. Here's a rough sketch of who the New Testament says encountered the risen Jesus and when. Mary Magdalene, alone, early that first morning. A group of women shortly after. 2 disciples walking the road to a nearby village. Peter individually. 10 of the remaining disciples gathered behind locked doors. A week later, all 11, including skeptical Thomas, who initially refused to believe without physical proof. 7 disciples by a lake. A gathering of disciples in Galilee. Jesus' own brother James, who, this is worth noting, had not believed in him during his lifetime. And, most strikingly, Paul writes that Jesus appeared to more than 500 people at once, adding that most of them were still alive at the time he was writing, effectively inviting his reader to go ask them directly. That detail matters. Paul isn't writing generations later, once eyewitnesses have long since died and legends had had time to grow. He's writing within about 20 years of the event, to communities that included people who could still fact-check the claim. So what explains this pattern? Let's look at the leading alternative theory. The most common modern explanation is that these appearances were hallucinations, grief-driven visions that felt real to the disciples but had no actual object in front of them. It's reasonable sounding theory on the surface, but it runs into basic feature of how hallucination actually work. According to what we understand psychologically, they are private experiences. One person's mind can generate a vivid personal hallucination, but hallucinations aren't something a group of people can share simultaneously, the way they might all look at the same tree. If 10 people are in a room and one of them hallucinates a figure standing in a corner, the other 9 don't spontaneously see the same figure at the same time, having the same conversation with it. Yet the New Testament repeatedly describes group appearances, the 10 disciples together, the 11 together a week later, 500 people at once. For the hallucination theory to work, you need not one hallucination, but many simultaneous, identical shared hallucinations, occurring on separate occasions to different combinations of people, something that has no real parallel in documented psychology. There's also a mismatch in expectation. People who experience grief hallucination typically do so because they desperately hoping to see the person again. But the Gospel account describes the opposite emotional state. The disciples are frightened, doubtful, hiding behind locked doors, and Thomas explicitly refused to believe without physical evidence. That's not the psychological profile of people primed to hallucinate what they are hoping for. It's the profile of people who have to be convinced again their expectation. And there's one more problem the hallucination theory doesn't touch at all. It doesn't explain the empty tomb. If the appearances were a purely psychological event happening only in the disciples' mind, Jesus' body should still have been lying in the tomb the whole time. The two puzzle pieces, the missing body and the reported appearances, only fit together cleanly if something actually happened to the body itself. Maybe the most interesting witnesses aren't the already devoted followers. They are the skeptics. Take Thomas. When the other disciple told him they've seen Jesus alive, he didn't say, "Wonderful, I believe you." He said, in effect, "Unless I put my own finger in the wound, I won't believe it." This is someone actively resistant to the claim, not an easy mark for an hallucination fueled by wishful thinking. Or take James, Jesus' own brother. The Gospels are candid that during Jesus' time, his own family, including James, did not believe he was who he claimed to be. In the ancient world, having your own household reject you was a significant embarrassment for any teacher. And yet, within the historical record, James turns up leading the Jerusalem church and eventually dies for his faith in his brother as the risen Son of God. Something moved him from skeptical brother to a leader willing to be martyred. The most straightforward explanation the sources themselves offer is a personal encounter with the risen Jesus. Then there is Paul, not a follower of Jesus at all, but an active persecutor of the early church, present at the killing of one of the first Christian martyrs. His own later writing describes an encounter with the risen Jesus that reversed his entire life's direction, turning history's most committed opponent of this new movement into one of the most tireless advocates. Skeptics don't typically talk themselves into hallucination of the very thing they actively resist. Here's a test worth applying to any claim. People will sometimes die for something they sincerely, even mistakenly, believe is true. But it's a very different thing to die defending a story you made up yourself, knowing it's false. Liars make poor martyrs, because at a critical moment, facing torture or execution, the incentive to simply admit the lie and save yourself is enormous. According to consistent early testimony, nearly every one of the original apostles ultimately suffered persecution or death for continuing to proclaim that Jesus had risen. If this had been a fabricated story, at least one of them, somewhere along the way, under threat, in prison, facing the executioner, would have had every reason to say, "It was a lie, we made it up," and save his own life. As far as the historical record shows, none of them did. That doesn't prove the resurrection by itself, but it strongly indicates something. Whatever these people saw, they were absolutely convinced it was real. They weren't defending a convenient myth. They were staking their lives on a memory. One last piece of evidence is easy to overlook because it is so large. The sheer existence and rapid growth of the early church. Within a matter of weeks after the crucifixion, a Jewish sect began proclaiming, in the very city where Jesus had been publicly executed as a criminal, that he was alive and was the promised Messiah. This wasn't a safe, comfortable claim to make. It invited the same authorities who had just killed Jesus to come after these followers next. And yet, according to the accounts in Acts, thousands of people in Jerusalem alone joined this movement almost immediately, in a city where anyone skeptical could simply walk over and check the tomb for themselves. Something has to explain why a movement centered on a crucified, supposedly failed Messiah didn't simply die out, the way other messianic movements of that era did when their leaders were killed. The early Christians themselves gave a consistent answer from the very beginning. They had seen him alive. So here's where 2 episodes have led us: an empty tomb that resists every natural explanation, and a wide range of reported appearances, to individuals, to skeptics, to groups of hundreds, that resist the leading psychological alternative. And behind both of these pieces of evidence stands a group of ordinary people who are willing to face suffering and death rather than deny what they said they seen. Taken together, this is why the resurrection functions, in the book's own words, as God's proclamation, his verdict, overturning the guilty verdict of what unjust trial, and confirming everything Jesus said about himself at that final meal. Next time, we turn to a more personal question. If all of this is true, what does it actually mean for my salvation today?